In this lesson, we're going to think about reasoning. There are entire courses on argumentation and reasoning, so there's simply not enough time to cover everything that you should learn about argumentation and reasoning and debate. So what we're going to go over are just two of the basic ideas. The idea of a rhetorical proof and logical fallacies, which are essentially ways that we make poorly reasoned arguments. So let's get started with rhetorical proofs. In this class, your arguments can also be called rhetorical proofs. Rhetorical proofs, unlike pure argumentation and/or logical proofs, don't ensure that you are 100% correct. They only offer support that your conclusions are correct. Think of it in terms of our criminal justice system. When you're sitting on the jury, what's the standard of proof that a lawyer must meet in order to convict someone? Do they have to prove with 100% certainty that a person accused of the crime committed the crime? No, they don't. Instead, they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the accused committed a crime. Think of that as your burden of proof as well. You need to provide enough support for your claims that your audience members will likely walk away thinking that you're probably right. With good evidence and solid arguments, you make this burden of proof much easier to reach. Your book gives you more details about the basics of argumentation, and it's pretty simple to understand. So what I want to talk about today are logical fallacies. Your book chapter covers these too, but I want to go over the ones that I've most commonly see students mistakenly use in their speeches over the years. Recognize too that for some reason the argumentation and debate community sometimes has 2 or 3 different names for the same fallacy. So you may hear me talk about a fallacy here that's called something else in your textbook or in a philosophy or English book. The first logical fallacy to consider is what we call hasty generalization. When we use this fallacy, we draw conclusions about an entire group of people, places, or things based on too few or atypical examples. These are really also the building blocks of many stereotypes. Imagine that you're walking on campus and you meet someone who's in a fraternity or sorority and they're rude to you. If from that experience, or even 2 or 3 more, you conclude that all people in the group system are rude, in the Greek system are rude, you've committed the fallacy of hasty generalization. You can't claim something is true of the whole with only evidence of a few instances or by using atypical experiences to conclude that all this, that, or another act or function similarly. The post hoc fallacy is named after the Latin phrase for after this. This is when we mistake temporal sequence, or the fact that one event occurs after another, for cause and effect. After the horrible events of 9/11, we saw this argument made by folks critical of the Bush administration. Some people argued that because Bush was in charge of the country during the attacks, his administration was to blame for them. That's a post hoc fallacy. Bush's administration did bear some responsibility, but so too did the presidential administrations going as far back as Reagan's or perhaps even further back. The events of 9/11 were a culmination of responses to decades of U.S. policy in the Middle East, and so blaming the Bush administration alone because it happened after he was made president is mistaking temporal sequence for cause and effect, and thus was a clear post hoc fallacy. The single cause fallacy happens when we attribute a problem to only one cause. Think about the issue of teen pregnancy. If someone were to make the argument that if we just gave condoms out for free in middle and high school we could eliminate teen pregnancy, that would be a single cause fallacy. Obviously, the problem is much more complex than one single element like condom distribution. Most problems are very complex, and you may often be in the position where you can only address one part of a very complex problem, and that's okay. Just communicate to your audience that you understand the issue you're discussing is complex, but that you only have time to cover one element of a possible solution, and that by dealing with that one part of the problem, you understand that we minimize the problem to some extent. That's the way to deal with speeches about complex issues when you don't have enough time to discuss the issue in all of its complexity. The slippery slope fallacy is exactly what it sounds like. It's when an argument assumes, without evidence, that one event is the first in a series of events that will inevitably lead to some conclusion. A good example of a slippery slope argument is the argument that marijuana is a gateway drug. The argument claims that people who smoke marijuana are far more likely to try and then become addicted to more serious drugs, ultimately making the claim that smoking marijuana will ultimately turn you into a heroin addict. There's no evidence to support that the first step of smoking marijuana will inevitably lead to the final step of overdosing on heroin. But the argument still gets made with some regularity in our society, in spite of the fact that it's a big old slippery slope and thus an illogical claim. The next logical fallacy to consider is the false analogy. Remember when we talked about using analogies as a type of supporting material? When someone uses a false analogy, they've constructed an analogy for their argument, but the analogy isn't a legitimate one, usually because the person has compared two things that aren't really similar enough to be compared via an analogy. For example, I'm not sure if it's still there, but for a while one of the Basic English 15 anthologies had an essay comparing TV addiction to crack cocaine addiction. I'm sure that you can see the attractiveness in communicating that analogy. We take all the negative things we know about crack cocaine addiction and we transfer all those negative things onto television addiction. But because TV addiction doesn't do to someone's body and life the same things that crack addiction does, all we're really transferring over are negative emotions associated with crack cocaine onto television. Again, it's easy to see why that's an attractive argument, because you can get people to feel negatively about TV and move forward with your position pretty quickly. But it's a logical fallacy, because those things just aren't similar enough to be compared. So be careful when you decide to create analogies, and remember that they have to have enough things in common to be compared legitimately. You're probably very familiar with the next type of logical fallacy, the ad hominem fallacy, which is simply Latin for to the person. More simply put, it's name-calling. This happens when instead of attacking the substance of someone's argument, the person just calls the first person a name. It's used by people who don't have the evidence to back up a counter-argument, or by folks who know that they can't beat the argument of the other person. So they do it, hoping that by calling someone a name, audience members will not fairly consider the other person's argument, or will shut it out completely. So if in a political debate someone makes an argument, and instead of countering that policy idea with another idea, or challenging that policy idea on its merits, the person calls the politician a Nazi, chances are pretty good you're looking at an ad hominem attack. Remember, though, that just because someone uses an unflattering name for someone's policies, like fascist, that doesn't necessarily mean ad hominem has taken place. If the only argument in response to a policy suggestion is "you're a fascist," then it's probably an ad hominem. But if the person addresses the argument specifically and talks about how that policy is similar to one seen in fascist states, that may not be an ad hominem attack. That might just be a legitimate critique. Ad populum arguments are arguments from the people. This happens when instead of appealing to the substance of an argument, someone just points to popular opinion to support his or her claim. The idea is sort of a majority rules perspective, and in some cases majorities do in fact rule. But when we're talking about issues that are grounded in our Constitution, like freedom of religion, freedom of speech, or the right to bear arms, it's not good enough to just say, well, the majority thinks we should do this, so we should. Consider that argument in other spheres. So if people think that we should bring back slavery, we should just do it? If the majority thinks that we should imprison all blonde people, should we do it? Of course not. So be very careful when using statistics to point to the majority opinion on an issue. Depending on the issue, it may be the case that the rule of law trumps majority opinion, and it may even be the case that the evidence to the contrary of majority opinion makes an ad populum appeal illogical. I'm not saying that you can't point to opinion polls, but you do have to be careful about how you use those polls and how you frame that information for your audience. Appeals to tradition are exactly what they sound like they are. Appeals to the fact that we've always done it this way, in place of an actual argument in favor of something. Go back to the slavery issue I just talked about. Should we have maintained slavery in this country because we'd always had it? Of course not. There are certainly times when you can talk about tradition as important to the community, but to rely solely on the notion that we should maintain policy because it's always been that way is fallacious. Emotive language manipulates the connotative meaning of words to establish a claim without proof. In politics, unfortunately, we hear frequently folks calling each other communists, Nazis, fascists, zealots, dictators, and the like. The use of these terms manipulates the fact that we tend to have negative predispositions towards these words. Rather than addressing the argument at hand, some will just use one of those terms, or even use Hitler in place of Nazi, to try and personify an opponent, using language that sole purpose in the person's use of it is to transfer negative feelings we have about someone like Hitler to another person, even if they have nothing in common with Hitler. Begging the question, or circular reasoning, happens when, in addressing an argument, someone uses the very claim that's up for debate as his or her answer to the opposing argument. So for an example, if an all-women's college is considering opening its doors to men, and opponents claim, "we shouldn't let men in because this is a women's college," That's begging the question, because the very argument they just made, that this is a women's college, is the very argument up for debate, that it shouldn't be anymore. So the person's argument is deemed circular because it doesn't lead anywhere except to the very claim that's already up for debate. People who make straw person arguments put forth an argument that they claim an opponent made that the opponent didn't make, and that argument is usually a weak or unreasonable argument that's easy to dismiss. So for instance, if someone says that they want to reconsider how we fund schools in our country, and in response the second person claims that the first person clearly wants to privatize our school system, unless privatization is what the person suggested, that's a straw person argument, because the first person never said that. The other person in debate is hoping that audiences won't realize that the first person never actually made that privatization claim and will instead side with the person who's just made the straw argument. Red herrings are arguments that divert listeners away from what's being discussed and onto an irrelevant matter. So suppose someone has made an argument and another person responds by saying, "That's not true, but the whole ballot has gotten too long and unmanageable to even consider using it for the elections anyway." What that person did was ignore the substance of the argument that the other person made and instead jump to another topic entirely so as to not have to answer the argument made by the other person. The final fallacy I want to talk about is the false choice or false dichotomy fallacy. This happens when two positions are submitted as the only two possibilities in a debate. The example on the slide is a relatively famous one from a post-9/11 speech of President Bush's. In beginning to make a case for a preemptive attack on Iraq, he claimed that people in countries either had to agree with our plans to combat terrorism or else they were with the terrorists. Putting politics aside, I'm sure you can see where that sort of argument is terribly illegitimate, and that there are clearly many, many other alternatives to dealing with terrorism other than the two presented by President Bush. So that's it for logical fallacies. Do your best to avoid these common fallacies in your speeches. My experience has been that often these pop up in student speeches, not because students create them themselves, but because students take arguments from other sources that are loaded with fallacies and don't think through those arguments before presenting them. Remember that you're responsible for any information you bring into a speech, whether it's information you create yourself or information you're crediting to another person. So you need to make sure that any arguments you make are free from logical fallacies. I watch a good deal of television news, and logical fallacies fill the air every day and night in talk and political shows. So please be careful when deciding to use an argument made by someone else, because you'll be held accountable for the logical fallacy if you use it in your speech. Your daily assignment for this unit of the class is going to ask you to read some arguments and then match the illogical argument with its logical fallacy. So make sure that you understand these arguments before attempting that assignment.